Hello, friends. Welcome to Medicine Stories. This is episode 8. I'm Amber Magnolia Hill, and today I'm speaking with Stephen Harrod Buhner. For those in the herbal world, Stephen needs no introduction, but for newcomers, anyone who has not heard of Stephen, I'm just going to read his bio off his website, somewhat shortened. Stephen Harrod Buhner is an earth poet and the award-winning author of 20 books on nature, indigenous cultures, the environment, and herbal medicine. Stephen's work has appeared or been profiled in publications throughout North America and Europe, including Common Boundary, Apotheosis, Shaman's Drum, the New York Times, CNN, and Good Morning America. Stephen teaches about herbal medicine, the sacredness of plants, the intelligence of nature, and the states of mind necessary for successful habitation of Earth. He is a tireless advocate for the reincorporation of the exploratory artist, independent scholar, amateur naturalist, and citizen scientist in American society, especially as a counterweight to the influence of corporate science and technology. So aside from Stephen's vast herbal knowledge, one reason that I've been drawn to his work over the years is because like what I'm trying to do with this podcast, through his writings and teachings, Stephen encourages us to listen to what calls us. Stephen calls them golden threads. It's what I've called mythic threads on this show. In his book, Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm, he writes, "For deeper reasons than any of us can ever know, of all the connections that run through the world, there are certain ones that touch us more strongly, that call us, that become golden threads that generate in us what James Hillman called notitia, the attentive noticing of the soul." I love that idea, the attentive noticing of the soul. This reminds me of something that Rumi wrote: "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray." So through reading Stephen's books, you learn about herbs, and then you also are encouraged to go deeper within. And that's just exactly the kind of person that I want to be learning from. So just a few of the things that we talk about today, and then I'm going to talk about a few other things before playing the interview, are Stephen's memories of his physician great-grandfather and how DNA carries more than just physical information down through the generations. The tendency toward high sensitivity in plant people, sensory gating channels, and how we discern meaning from the touch of the world upon us, plant perception, and the neural networks and root systems. Humans do not have a monopoly on intelligence. The function of psychedelics in the ecosystem, apart from and long before human use. How we can recover the intelligence of the heart in the direct perception of nature. Visionary plant encounters and knowing plants through dreaming states. The nature of viral and bacterial life forms, how we have misunderstood them for generations. What happened during the Great Flu pandemic 100 years ago in 1918. How the world is now uniquely positioned for the reemergence of new and more virulent infectious diseases. How herbs are far more effective at treating these infections than technological medicine. And how so many people are becoming interested in herbalism right as the age of, quote, miracle drugs comes to an end. Stephen shares his opinion on whether or not humans and the earth will survive the times we're in. And for the record, I agree with him 100%. We talk about personal empowerment in a culture where most of us have handed over our power to experts and institutions. And finally, what's on Stephen's mind as he enters his elder years and watches a new generation of herbalists emerge as his go out. So our talk is really based on 3 of Stephen's 22 books. He's got 2 more in the works that we also talk about in the interview. Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm. The subtitle is Beyond the Doors of Perception into the Dreaming of Earth. I think that's basically the best book title of all time. I remember clearly the first time I saw it, I was like, jaw drop, mindgasm, like, need this book now. And so the things we talk about related to that book, if you want to go further, are psychedelics, or Stephen's term neurognostics, which I really love, sensory gating channels, and yeah, plant intelligence. And then the book, The Secret Teachings of Plants, The Intelligence of Heart and the Direct Perception of Nature. This is when we talk about the feeling sense and being in communion with the wider world. And then his book, Herbal Antivirals, when we talk about infectious diseases and viral intelligence. So Stephen also has a book called Herbal Antibiotics, and I remember really clearly also the first time I saw these books on someone's bookshelf, being very drawn to them and immediately understanding, without even having to look at the title, just looking at the spines, that these were really important books and that this was information I wanted to know and that everyone should know. So I bought them, and it actually took me a long time to save up to buy them. This is during my really broke single mama years, but they were always on my Amazon wish list. I knew that these books were coming into my life. And I've since read them many times and really become almost obsessed with viral infections and really trying to understand them and prepare myself and my family for them. So one of the most profound effects that the book Herbal Antivirals had on my life is that it led to the formulation of our extra potent elderberry elixir in the fall of 2016 that has since become the foundation of our herbal line, Mythic Medicinals. So this was during Standing Rock, and Standing Rock was putting calls out for herbal medicine. And I really wanted to make something that would be valuable to the people there on the ground. One thing they were asking for was elderberry elixirs. And so I went back into Herbal Antivirals. I read it for the third or fourth time. I took a ton of notes. And between reading that book, thinking about my own experience with these plants and with having cold and flu, and my intuitive pull towards certain plants as I was formulating this medicine, and reading plenty of writings from other herbalists, especially Kiva Rose, I came up with this recipe and put it out there. And ever since then, it has just sold like mad. It sells out every time we release it within 1 to 7 days. It just completely takes over our lives for a week or more every time we put out a new batch. So at the time of the release of this podcast, I think we'll have a new batch out. You can check it out at mythicmedicine.love/shop. But I make no promises. If you listen to it later, they might be sold out. They might sell out quickly. I'm not really sure how it's going to go, but I'm really, really grateful to Stephen for helping me know like some of the most potent plants I could put in here. There's plenty. And in his book, he goes over many strongly antiviral herbs. And in Herbal Antibiotics, he talks about strongly antibacterial herbs. And so we don't really talk about specific plants in this area of infectious diseases in the podcast. But if you're listening, wondering like, well, which plants? You can find them in those books. And also in the listing for the elderberry elixir on my website, I have photographs of some of the pages from his book to kind of give people an impetus to grow in them the desire to want to get these books and read them. So a couple of the things that our elixirs have that was inspired by Stephen are fresh ginger juice, not powdered ginger. I learned from him that if you're using ginger for a viral infection, it needs to be fresh. Like a ginger tea bag isn't going to help you with that. It might help your stomach ache or something, but it's not going to help knock out an infection. We also added licorice on the advice of the book, and there's a lot of good raw local honey in there, plus many other herbs. So you can look at my website. I don't want to go too deeply into that, but thank you for that, Stephen. And so my interest in infectious diseases and viruses, and just how much Stephen's book sparked this interest for me even further, has led me down many roads. And I think about this stuff all the time, and I like to share about it when I can. So a couple weeks ago, I did an Instagram live video all about viral infections and got so much good feedback from it that I have shot it again, since it disappears after 24 hours when you do an Instagram live, and put it up on my blog. So that's mythicmedicine.love/blog. You can watch that video. And in it, I talk about common misconceptions about cold and flu, including the misuse of commonly used herbs like citrus, ginger, echinacea, how suppressing symptoms is not only not treating the infection, but can often make it worse, the treatment guidelines that my family follows, and the 3 things I always have on hand every day of the year in case someone in my family starts to get sick, and other ways to empower yourself before you're too sick to do anything but lie in bed. So, speaking of empowerment, I was really struck by what Stephen had to say about that here. It's brief, but I think it's so, so important. And it's something that I think about a lot, but have really struggled to articulate because I don't want to sound condescending or judgmental. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to articulate it here, my thoughts around this that I've been building for many years. And to do that, I'm going to tell a story. This is a true story. This is about a family I know, and I know 4 generations of this family. So we're going to call them the matriarch and patriarch, or the great-grandparents. And then there are the grandparents. And then the parents, who are my age now. And then the kids, who are around my daughter's ages. You know, they range from baby now to teenager. And so starting with the great-grandparents, the matriarch and patriarch, this would have been in the 50s. They had super medicated births. This was the time of twilight birth. So the mom had those kind of births. She formula fed. She wouldn't dare think of actually nursing her babies. It was so far below her at that point. And we're just feeding the kids processed food, like so many of us still do. And like it really started around the 50s, processed food being heavily advertised to stay-at-home moms, and miracle foods, frozen dinners. And so then this next generation, who are now the grandparents, they raise their kids the same way. Super medicated births, would not even think about breastfeeding, it's just so archaic and gross, and very processed foods. And so now the parents, who are my age, have done the exact same thing. And, technological birth has gone even further over the edge now with inducements and unnecessary C-sections. We know so much more now about the importance of breastfeeding, but every mom in this generation too was like, gross, I would never. I remember them looking at me nursing my first daughter like, ew. And always running to the doctor immediately when the kids are sick has happened in all these generations. So now with the kids, the 4th generation, there's a lot of them, they are all really sick all the time. When I was over there years ago, I remember one of the grandmas like yelling out, and she did this like big gesture with her body, "Why are my grandkids always sick?" And I wanted to be like, I know why, but it's so hard to talk to people about these things. I love this family. I don't want to seem holier than thou, but it's the lifestyle choices that they have made generation by generation and moment by moment. So these kids now still, I see them sitting in front of the TV watching things that are totally age inappropriate and just being like shoveled Cheetos and Oreos and things to eat, and then constantly, like monthly, going to the doctor when they're sick and getting put on more antibiotics. And so much of the time, these are viral infections that these children have. They are not bacterial infections. Antibiotics do not address viral infections, and doctors know this, but they will prescribe them anyway just to shut the parents up and get them out of their office. And so I'm watching as these kids get sicker and sicker, allergies, autoimmune issues. It's really sad. It's really sad. And I see how frustrated and sad the parents and grandparents are watching these children be so ill and feeling completely disempowered to deal with it and to help their children live long, strong, healthy lives. In fact, one of the little ones has an issue that's going to end her life at a much younger age than it would otherwise. And I did look it up to see if this issue was epigenetic, and it is, meaning that if different lifestyle choices had been made by her ancestors, those genes may not have been turned on that gave her this disease from birth. So I also knew the fifth generation ancestor in this whole family. And, she was healthy as a horse. She didn't have an antibiotic a day in her life. She birthed her babies naturally and breastfed them. And her children and their spouses just had the misfortune of being born in a time in the 1950s, or having their children in a time, they were born in about the 20s, when it was the age of miracle drugs and technological innovations and experts, and just hand your power over to us and we will take care of everything. And they did that, and they didn't question it. They didn't question it at all. And now they're really paying for it, and it's really hard to see and to watch. We know enough now about epigenetics that it seems to me that starting to take, if this is like you and your family, you're like, yes, this is so familiar to me, taking your power back and learning what you can slowly over time, integrating the lessons, you can change the story for your family going forward. You can reweave health back into your descendants and the people that you love and the people in your life. So, I grew up eating nothing but processed food, being put constantly on antibiotics for ear infections, and just watching hours and hours a day of TV. But at some point, I just felt in my bones, like in my late teens and early 20s, that it was wrong and that there was another way. And I just started reading any books that I could find, seeking out any teachers I could about herbalism and other ways to live. And the fact that you're listening to this podcast tells me that you too wish to be empowered and wish to empower others. So I just wanted to expand a little bit on Stephen's brief sentences, because I think they're really important. And, he says that when he meets people who are totally disempowered, it's like almost shocking to him. And I feel the same way. Like when I see what people post online, sometimes I'm like, oh my God, you know nothing about taking care of your children. This is really basic, easy to find information. Like, it's out there. It's in Stephen's books. It's in other books. It's on podcasts and in articles and blog posts. It's at conferences and in forums online. And it just takes the willingness to seek it out and take it in and act on it. So I hope that what you hear in this podcast today and in everything that I do empowers you to empower you, inspires you to empower yourself and others. And let's just keep empowering ourselves and one another. So a few more things here. I have over 100 Patreon supporters now. It's growing so quickly since the last podcast where I really talked about it. Very grateful. And I do have a little Buhner related thing up on Patreon for you today. Years ago, I wrote to Stephen asking if he would sign a copy of Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm to me and my now 11-year-old daughter, Mycelia. I have this, I call it like legacy bookshelf for her, where I have sought out some of my favorite authors and asked them to sign the book to me and to her, or just to her. And these are just like my very favorite authors, the books that have really meant something to me and changed my life. And Stephen agreed. And so I sent the book off to him and he mailed it back to me. And I could not read what the inscription said, which I have a lot of sympathy for because my handwriting is awful. And after we ended this call, Stephen and I spoke a little bit longer and we talked about that, just having no patience for writing things out by hand. Because for me, at least, my mind just works so much faster than my hand that I'm like so frustrated trying to write things out. But anyway, I asked him what the inscription said and read it to him, and we like parsed it out and figured out what it says. So I have the photo up there of what he wrote and the translation of what it says, and then the meaning of what it means, because there's a word in there that you probably don't know. I didn't know it until I read it in Stephen's books. And lastly, don't forget to enter the garden party giveaway with Sophia Rose from episode 3 of this show. You can enter it by joining the Medicine Stories Facebook group. Just search for Medicine Stories within Facebook. Ask to be added, and then the post is pinned to the top of the page there. If you don't know what garden party is, you can go to gardenparty.love to find out, or you can listen to the last podcast episode with Laura Valeda Vesta, and I explain it in the intro there. So she's given away a 1-year subscription to online learning via Garden Party. And you just comment under that post that's pinned to the top of the Medicine Stories Facebook group. And this will be ending on February 8th, which is my birthday. So, okay, that was enough of me talking. This is a wonderful, beautiful, to me, extremely meaningful conversation. Thank you, Stephen, for agreeing to talk to me. And thank you, everyone, for opening your heart and being here to take this transmission in. Oh, hey, wait. I just listened to the intro and I wanted to add a little something. I'm not able to really edit and make these intros just perfectly formed as much as I would like, because I just have like an hour here or there while the toddler sleeps to get in here and bust them out so I can get these episodes out into the world. So forgive the sometimes rambles and forgetting things, but I'm envisioning people writing me being like, what does technological birth and formula feeding have to do with all this? And I mean, I'm pretty sure you know about breastfeeding being extremely important to the development of the baby's immune system. It's a minute by minute conversation between the mama's body and the baby's body. So when I'm nursing little Nixie, if she's getting some sort of infection anywhere in her body, my body immediately knows it and immediately starts producing the antiviral or antibacterial or immune boosting compounds that her body needs to fight off the infection. And she gets that via my breast milk right away. So that's what I was referring to there. It's just so important for immunity to breastfeed. And then with birth, there's a lot to say there, but mostly, I think first of all, when babies are born via C-section, they don't get the probiotics in the vaginal canal that are the first inoculation of probiotics and of good bacteria onto their little bodies. They've been in the sterile environment of the womb for 9 months or however long, and then they come out, and that's a really important first inoculation of good bacteria is through the vagina. So when they come out through a slice in the abdomen, they don't get that, and it really it sets them up for a lifetime of just having different microbiota, not necessarily worse. And of course you can work with it, but it's going to be different. And it was, it's only pretty recently that we know that you can work with it. So for decades, children have come out via C-section, and awesome when it saves a life. I'm not against them at all. I'm against the unnecessary use of them because it depletes children of this really important first coating of bacteria. And then even without C-sections, when there's just like a heavily medicated birth, or, there's so much to say about birth, but it can really impair bonding between mama and baby, and that can impair breastfeeding, or that can impair how much time the mother spends holding the baby skin to skin on her body, which the more you do that, the better the immune system. So there's a lot to say about all of these things. I recently listened to an episode of the Adventures Through the Mind podcast called Primal Parenting and the Evolved Nest with Darsha Narvez. And I thought it was great. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, that podcast just really kind of breaks down everything. And I was really grateful for it. And it made me really grateful that I sought out this information and came across it and parented my babies the way I did, starting when I was in my early 20s, and really had to seek the information out. So that's that. That's not what this episode is about. Let's get into all of this awesome stuff with Stephen Harrod Buhner. Okay, hello, Stephen.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for talking to me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Just, a long time reader of your books. I've learned so much from you and really appreciate the way that you synthesize huge subjects and seemingly separated realms of knowledge and bring them together. And I'm honored to be speaking with you. And so I wanted to begin by by talking about your ancestors. This is something that you put in your books in little bits every now and then, but I want to hear the whole story. Like you, I was lucky enough to know 4 of my great-grandparents at the time.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, my oldest daughter was too. But you were especially close to your great-grandfather, Cecil Harrod, a physician who used mostly herbal preparations and from whom you get your middle name. You have written about... Yeah, no, I was going to quote you because I'd love to expand on this quote. You wrote about him. I remember the way he looked at me as we sat and talked in that room, which was his doctor's office, as if he could see deep inside me in ways I didn't, as a young child, understand. I remember the sound of his voice, the shape of his hands, the veins on their backs, the smell of tobacco. I remember his touch and how he held me late at night as I lay in bed with him while he told me stories of ancient days and magical times. As I fell slowly to sleep in his arms, I knew in some indefinable way that I was loved into the depths of me.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
That's beautiful. And you write in that same piece, which is the introduction to the German version of your book, Herbal Antibiotics, that it seems to me that DNA doesn't only carry physical memory. I think it carries other kinds of memories too. From those memories come glimpses of the lives of the ancestors whose DNA still stirs inside us. And so you come from at least 300 years of healers and doctors. You have other herbalists and healers in your lineage, and I'd love to hear about how you think these people have shaped who you are today and the path your life has taken.
Well, it's, both things, of course, the ones I knew and the ones that I never could know. And, the weird thing is that, I'm not very much a fan of reductive science, and it's gotten much worse as the decades have gone by, because reductive science just can't see holes, and it certainly is unwilling to perceive what you might call, or what's to them, invisibles that affect all of our lives. Now, it's pretty well known that our genome carries chromosomes which give us hair or eye color, for instance. But that always seemed to me to be too reductive, too simplistic. And, some new research that they've been doing has shown that if they terrify a mouse, for instance, I think I might sneeze in a minute, just so but they would terrorize a mouse with a stimulus, a spider, for instance, and there would be, a female mouse, and then the mouse would either be pregnant or would soon become pregnant. And what's interesting is that their offspring would have the same fear, even though they had never encountered that particular organism before. So, in a tiny way, they're starting to figure that out. But one of the things that, pretty much every indigenous culture on Earth talks about is that the importance of the ancestors. And, in our culture, we have very little respect for that, or even for elders who still happen to be with us. And, one African tribal group, a member of that was interviewed that I read someplace, I don't remember, and he said, the guy goes, "Do you pray to God?" And he goes, "Oh, no, we wouldn't pray to God. God's, really busy with a lot of stuff, and God's very, very far away. We would most often immediately pray to our ancestors because they're closest to us and they still remember what it's like to be a human being, and so they're much more willing to help us in our times of difficulty." And I've noticed in myself certain characteristics of mind, temperaments, all different kinds of things which were unique. And when you come to think about it, our genome carries the memories of our ancestors that go all the way back to first man and first woman, and really even beyond that, because there's all kinds of other life form genome blended in and DNA blended in with our own. So it's not surprising to me that there would be these influences that just aren't taken into account in large measure because they're so hard to identify or measure with the kind of instruments that science uses. But I remember quite clearly seeing photographs of some of my ancestors, and some of them were just like strangers, those odd old photographs you see and you go, oh, those people look funny. But then every so often I would come across one and it would be as if I knew them, as if I'd known them my whole life. And I've become very aware of these sort of presences in my life that, just as indigenous people say, are there to help us in our difficulties, and they seem very close to me for whatever reason. So, there's not a way to really easily explain that using a mechanicalistic science, but every culture on Earth certainly can't be completely stupid. The reductive scientists completely forget all of the time that human beings have tremendous capacities of perception, that the kind of science we do here has always been done by people to some extent, and that people in indigenous cultures, not in cities, were acute observers of their own internal world and their external world. So they talk about a lot of things that we've assumed don't exist, and rather than exploring those, most people in our culture just sort of go, well, they were superstitious children and they made this stuff up. But in fact, more and more all of the time, specifically I've seen it in my work with plant medicines, we're able to identify extremely subtle effects of plants in great detail, even though they were using an entirely different way of gathering that information. So, of course, all of this had a huge motivating factor in it was really my close relationship with my great-grandfather, because when he trained as a doctor, physicians then used mostly botanical medicines. They used some other things as well, but antibiotics didn't come into common use until after World War II, and at that point he was already about 60 years old. So he had this sort of way of interacting with people and interacting with the natural world that was substantially different than anything that I encounter now in an industrialized culture. And because of that, and he also had a farm, he had a house in the city and a farm out in the country surrounded by wild forests, and sort of those two things blended together inside me in a way and really led me to have a huge amount of value for that different path. It seems to engender a real different orientation toward one's own life as well as all the other life that people encounter. So just that sort of constant experience of being with him opened me up to a very different approach to life. And after he died when I was 11, and as I grew older and started immersing myself more in the sort of civilized world, I became aware more and more acutely that there was something really missing from the way most of us live our lives, and I certainly wasn't willing to do that so that at the end of my life I looked back and at my life and went, God, what a mistake. So that's sort of the short part of it, but those sort of influences that come from a different orientation of mind and heart really had a substantial impact on me, and I don't regret my choices for a second.
Do you think that perhaps your great-grandfather saw something in you, wished to nurture you with his love on a deep level?
Yeah, oddly enough, my brother and sister my sister's 6 or 7 years younger than me, my brother's a year younger, but neither of them seemed to have much memory of him, and he didn't seem to make that kind of impact on their life. And the older I've gotten, as I've aged and my eyes have matured, you might say, when I look back through my past with these older eyes, it's really clear that I was very different. I think people that end up working with the earth and plants the way I do, they're somewhat different than other people. You know, I had a very high sensitivity to, you know, just the tiniest shifts in meaning in people and in their conversations. I was very shy. I didn't really have a strong boundary between myself and the rest of the world, and I think that, I mean, my grandmother, his daughter, would say sometimes, you know, you're just too sensitive for this world. And then she sort of had her own version of kind of a visionary sight, and she'd sit around sometimes and she goes, I don't know, you know, maybe we should be like a forest ranger or something like that, you know, and you can kind of see how she was pointing to the world I ended up inhabiting anyway. And so, yeah, I do think that there was some sense on his part of something in me that needed the transmission of what he had to give, and he was very good at giving that. I think most young people need, I mean, Robert Bly would talk about how all young men need to find the father, and it's quite often not the birth father, but some man to whom, you know, in whom they carry this sort of awareness, and then it's transmitted from the older man to the young man, and it's usually passed in silence when they are just sitting or lying next to each other. And I think my great-grandfather was extremely aware of that. And so that's been sort of, you know, I think life is difficult, and the times we're in now are extremely difficult. And I think all of us need to find talismans of the good life. And in one way of looking at my own journey is that I've constantly sought out talismans of the good life, and which I keep inside myself to help orient me on my way. And one of those is certainly that relationship I had with my great-grandfather.
You speak about being sensitive as a child. I think that many of us who walk the plant path start life like that and continue through life like that. Is this innate sensitivity to the world and what comes at you through your senses and nervous system, what got you interested in sensory gating and sensory gating channels, and can you tell us what those are?
Well, yeah, there's a number of really tremendous illusions, or as I sometimes refer to it, bad software that we've been inculcated with since we were children, because the rationalist and the monotheist paradigms don't really capture the complexity of the world very well, and they both have investments in their particular paradigm, and they each try to pass it on to people as if there's no other options. But life is far more complex than that, and I happen to, one of the things that happens to all of us if we decide to look at life this way is that there's these strange moments of serendipity that occur in our life where, we'll sit down on the park bench and find a book that somebody left there, and it happens to be a book our soul needed us to find on that particular day. And these things, they don't happen exactly every minute, but they're very, very common. And, my birth family, my mother, father, sibling, that whole structure was extremely dysfunctional, like a lot of people's are. And so when I turned 16, I filed emancipation papers and left home, and I moved to California and got there on January 1st, 1969 in San Francisco, Berkeley area, because I could just feel there was something interesting going on there. I had $40, I think, something like that, and which was virtually nothing. And I ended up, through an odd series of coincidences, finding this flat to live in with a bunch of people who were going to the university there. And one of the guys living there was a guy named Mark Geyer, who was studying for his PhD, and he was one of the people that ended up developing the whole concept of sensory gating channels. So it's this kind of odd thing that happened. And really, you might say, the way to explain what they are, it's, everybody's pretty aware of the lens of our eye, that, when there's a lot of light coming in, that lens narrows down to control the amount of light. When it's really dark, that lens expands considerably to let in as much light as possible. And sensory gating channels are exactly like that. We have what's commonly called 5 sensory mechanisms. We really have 6, which is the 6th one being our ability to feel the touch of meaning upon us, which is more oriented toward heart than it is the brain. But we basically have, our ears, our nose, our skin, et cetera, our taste. And these are all sensory mechanisms to give us information about the world. And another one is our heart, which is also a sensory mechanism, which, is focused on the feeling of things, like going to a restaurant, for instance, and that we've never been, and we walk in and we go, God, this place feels kind of weird, let's leave. And everybody has that experience, but it's just simply been, removed from our kind of American conversation. So the thing is that people that are extremely sensitive, their sensory gating channels tend to be far more open than others. And so the amount of sensory data that comes in is very large. Now, one of the things that is routinely missed because of the reductive orientation that we're sort of immersed in is that the sensory input, the visual sensory input that comes in, is not simply composed of colors, but there's also some dynamic that goes along with that, the feel of the thing. And, if you just spend any time, you go and see a various number of chairs and you just ask yourself, you focus on one and let the visual image develop, and then you say, how does it feel? There'll be this kind of intimation of mood that emerges in your awareness. We might not have an exact name for it, and the reason why we don't is that our culture has spent the majority of its time focusing on the minutiae of the exterior world, but we have very little cultural depth in looking at people's interior world, except for some fairly limited means such as psychotherapeutic modalities. And when you do that, really each sensory impression carries with it some sort of meaning that gives rise to that particular intimation of mood or feeling. And it's most easily understandable when you think about music, because musical notes, although they're a sound, and that, they can talk about the vibration rate of it that produces that sound, the reason why music works so well for us is it bypasses the conscious mind and generates a complex of feelings inside the listener. So everybody's aware of that. We just don't talk about it. So people that are very sensitive, that have extremely open gating channels, tend to be pulling in a lot more sensory data than other people, and they also tend to be much more aware of the meanings that are also embedded in those sensory flows. So they're really working with sort of an invisible world that everybody's aware of to some extent, but that is just not talked about very much. And that's why a lot of the people like that tend to become artists of one sort or another, because that allows them an output for it. But that's sort of the short of it. And, Mark Geyer ended up spending most of his career looking at two things: the impacts of psychotropic drugs on sensory gating channels, as well as the dynamics of sensory gating channels in people that are labeled schizophrenic. And schizophrenia is really kind of a constant visionary state, more than anything else, like somebody's high on LSD all the time. And the thing is that the metaphors or the sort of the maps that our culture has for people to use to make sense of how they're oriented in space and time and meaning aren't really very good. And so schizophrenics very rarely can find somebody that can explain to them the territory that they just live inside of most of the time. And in consequence, there's a lot of confusion on their part. You might say misdefinition of what they're perceiving. So that's sort of a short look at it, really.
When I was 16, I had a big psilocybin experience, a big mystical, eye-opening experience. I didn't know that was possible. I just ate too many shrooms and ended up there. And it was really life-changing and beautiful. And I didn't know what had happened to me. I didn't understand it. But a few years later, I stumbled upon Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. And I read about his reducing valve theory. And that theory says that there's so much sensory stimuli coming at us all the time that our brains have to reduce it down. They have this reducing valve, and so everything coming at us gets filtered out. Most things coming at us get filtered out, so we can just focus on survival in the here and now and what's important. And this is basically what sensory gating is, although it's maybe more diffused throughout the body and the different organ systems and things like that. But so how do psychedelics affect our sensory gating channels?
Well, Aldous Huxley, he actually got that concept from the poet William Blake, who had talked about that in some depth, and then he took it a bit further, and then, of course, researchers. Oddly enough, Mark Geyer was, Albert Hoffman talked about it a lot, the discoverer of LSD, and who did a lot of research on psilocybin. And so that thing really sort of continued into Mark's work later in life, though in a much more sort of dispassionate dynamic. But that's really one of the things that hallucinogenic drugs do, or I really prefer to call them neurognostics, because they shift the neural functioning of the brain, and gnosis means, knowledge. And so this kind of understanding of things that are normally imperceptible to the conscious mind, we start being able to perceive them and start to work with them to some extent. So that's really the function of, neurognostics, and because they've been around for hundreds of millions of years, some of them, and they've, long before the human species emerged. And one of the things that's continually missed in the sort of reductive, mechanicalistic view is that nothing emerges in the world ecosystem without an ecological function. And the question that people have never asked, and oddly enough, the most important questions tend to be the simplest ones. Then for some reason they're the ones people never ask, and we often do as children ask some of them. Like I remember one asking, do cows in France moo different than cows in the United States? Because people in France talk different. Everybody goes, no, cows always moo the same. Of course, they hadn't done any research or thought on it, but, that's just sort of it. But, of course, then I was really pleased to find, maybe 10 or 15 years ago that scientists studying cow linguistics found out that cows in France very much do have a different language than the ones in the United States. So, asking these very simple questions that children tend to do, and that kind of childlike wonder that all of us had at once till we were trained out of it and can have again, really leads to some of the best understandings of the world we're in. And one of those is, what's the function of hallucinogenics in the ecosystem? And so I wrote about that a lot in my book, Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm, and that particular book. And so, when you look at plants, a lot of people say, well, plants are really stupid because they don't have a brain. And but the thing that's missed is that the brain is just simply an organ that holds our neural network. It's not the brain itself that's important, but rather the complexity and structure of the neural network. And plant root systems are identical in appearance and in structure in many ways to our own neural network. And they use the same neurochemicals our brain uses and act in very much the same way. They have memory, sensory perception, and so on. So looking at the impacts on neural functioning in plants from hallucinogens in, various species that researchers, they gave LSD to everything they could find. And it turns out that it has the same impact on every neural network that it encounters. And what it does is that it opens sensory gating channels very wide so that more sensory data comes in, but not just simple sensory data, also the meanings that accompany that. And so there's this sort of deeper perception of dynamics in the ecosystem, and it allows whatever organism takes or ingests those substances to create behaviors outside of the habituated patterns. So it really allows a kind of innovation that wasn't available prior to that. And that really seems to be their function in ecosystems, because when there's environmental pressures that happen, and psilocybin, which is a mycelial network that runs under grasslands, for instance, and that network is connected to the roots of virtually every plant there, then that whole ecosystem begins to innovate its responses to environmental perturbations. And it's an important thing, and many of the visionary experiences like vision quests and things like that adolescents would undergo in indigenous cultures perform the same function, that sensory gating channels open very wide, people become aware of sophistications in the world that they weren't previously aware of, and it begins to orient them toward a sort of life work in a different way than going to college does, for instance.
Yeah, it's such a paradigm-shifting idea to realize that psychedelics, I love the word neurognostics. You have a really wonderful paragraph in that book where you break down like every word that people use to describe these substances and exactly what the word means. That they were here long before humans were here. That DMT, psilocybin have functions in the ecosystem beyond just humans coming along and using them and having a good time. This idea of neuroplasticity, right, that they help us change our behavior. They break us out of the habituated patterns that we've been stuck in.
Right. Our neural network literally begins to change its dynamics. And so what we perceive, what we can innovate, what we do all begins to shift. And that's, an important dynamic. I don't think there's anybody alive now that isn't aware that there's something seriously amiss in our world, and people don't really know what to do. There's a feeling of helplessness, as if these massive powers are moving through the human world, whether it's governments or institutions or corporations, and they just don't really know what to do. And one of the things I've seen that came out of the 60s was there were so many people taking psychotropics back then, and then if you start looking at all of the innovations that those people came up with, from Apple computers to the different kinds of music to herbal medicines, it goes on and on and on, that there was this massive movement out of contemporary form and the generation of very different approaches to things that have had a great impact on the way our world is now. And neuroplasticity is a very important thing. I mean, the last thing we all need is to become our conservative parents. And not only is it not very much fun, it doesn't really, we just sort of perpetuate the same old systems of thought, which really are no longer useful.
So do you feel heartened by the new sort of resurgence of psychedelic research happening at such high levels in universities?
Not really, because the university system is by its nature incredibly conservative. And, excuse me a second. And there's not a lot of support for moving outside existing paradigms. I mean, and one of the reasons James Lovelock, who came up with the Gaia theory, was able to do that was because he was an independent researcher, and he had invented something used to analyze atmospheric content, and he patented it, and that gave him enough money that he wasn't dependent on exterior institutions. And his observations about the Earth when he came up with that, they're obvious in hindsight. They're not anything different than the majority of indigenous cultures or even ancient cultures have been saying. And yet, once he came up with that, he was attacked incredibly intensely by scientists who were, heavily invested emotionally and intellectually in the older system of thought. And one of the things he said, which was really neat, he said, well, the neat thing about it is, having enemies is that they force you to focus your thinking, which is one of their real functions. And so the more they attacked what they saw as limits in his thinking caused him to go deeper and design more ways of showing that it was true, until finally it became generally accepted that the Earth acts as a single living organism. Now, what the reductive scientists are trying to do now is turn that into something they call Earth system science, where they say, yes, the Earth is exactly like a superorganism, this single living organism, but it's not intelligent, it's just, and so the last thing that system can do is attribute intelligence equal or superior to human beings to anything in the natural world. And so, for instance, there's a new science of plant neurobiology that is gaining a lot of steam, and because they're looking at the neural network of plants and saying, well, plants are highly intelligent, highly communicative. They engage in tool making through their innovation of chemical structures over and over. They have a complicated language. They have culture, and on and on and on. And, the thing is that the people that are working in that field now tend to be extremely stubborn and extremely smart. So the more they're attacked, the better their work becomes. But nevertheless, what we're looking at is a shifting paradigm. And, when I was young, I thought a paradigm shift would be fun. But what I realized with more maturity is that the existing paradigms are connected into the entire culture and infrastructure of that culture. And a lot of people have huge survival investments in that old paradigm being true. And there isn't any way that they will give it up because of the threat that giving it up creates to their survival. So what we're looking at, and a large reason why the cultures of the Earth are going through the kind of incredible disarray they are, is one paradigm is really dying and another one is slowly coming into being, and the old institutional structures have to fall away. So when they do that kind of research in universities, although some aspects of it are positive, the last thing that they're ever going to end up saying is that, people should be able to take neurognostics whenever they want, and especially teenagers. And I remember I was speaking about this several years ago, and some guy raises his hand. He goes, well, don't you think that teenagers should only be able to do this under the guidance of a more mature person? And I looked at the guy and I go, well, how many teenagers have you known? And when you were a teenager, how would you have acted in that situation? I mean, it's like, teenagers are not going to go, well, yes, I want to do this, but I want to do it responsibly. So what I'm going to do is find a hallucinogenic mentor. That's not what teenagers do. They tend to follow urges in themselves, which lead to a lot of interesting memories. Sometimes they survive it, sometimes they don't. But nevertheless, that drive inside human beings, the last thing that they're going to do generally is look for a mentor. So, that kind of attempt to control breaking out of the old paradigm it's not going to work. And there's going to be a great deal of, you might say, simplistic thinking that comes out of the universities, despite the fact that they're finding hallucinogens are good for PTSD and quite a number of different things. But, I'm very much in favor of human beings choosing their own course for well or ill. And I have a lot of faith in the individual genius of human beings. And that's something that seems to be in really short supply these days. There's a tremendous assumption that human beings in mass are, pretty stupid, and they really need, some sort of an elite group of people to control their behavior so that they, don't cause trouble. And it's just not a belief I subscribe to.
Touching on much of what we've already said, let's talk about plant intelligence more and the perception of the heart in plant intelligence. There's interest in herbalism is just exploding today. More and more books, articles, online courses coming out all the time. And growing up in the West, we think that we get knowledge through books and through the brain and intellectual learning. What is what you call the intelligence of the heart in the direct perception of nature, and how can we utilize it to take a different path in getting to know the plants in the natural world?
Well, one of the real problems that we face, I think James Hillman said it most perfectly. He said, we've lost the response of the heart to what's presented to the senses. And I think that's one of the major differences between my great-grandparents and people today, is that it had never occurred to them to doubt the response of their heart to what's presented to the senses. And so they had an aesthetic dimension to their life that we've been trained out of. So for me, I've had visionary experiences for various different reasons since I was young. And, what really got me into plant medicine, I mean, these events that change our lives, the beginning signals that start to turn us away from the path we're on are often so subtle and simple that most people never consciously notice them. And I had been wanting to find land like my great-grandfathers in some way for much of my life. And so in 1985, we bought some land at about 9,000 feet outside of Boulder, Colorado, and it was very wild land. It had never been logged or farmed or ranched or anything else. It was extremely wild, and the plant diversity was huge. And so, that had been a drive from when I was very young. Now, you could an interesting question is, why did I have that particular drive, and why didn't I let go of it and become a good children who obeyed, But there was just something in me, some drive in the deeps of me that said that's what I had to do. And so we finally got some money together for a deposit, and there were some parcels of land for sale up a very difficult road outside of Boulder, and we went up there, and there were 4 parcels of the 7 still for sale. And so we were driving along there, and we get to the 3rd parcel, and it was almost as if a hand reached out from the and put its, rested itself on our shoulder and said, here. And we were just pulled into that place. Now, these sort of happen all the time, but most people don't really think about them that way. And so we went, well, this is the one. Of course, it was the most expensive one, irritatingly, but nevertheless, that's the one we got. And, I built a house, and we started living there, and one day, about, a year and a half or so into it, this odd thought just came in my head, like, I should learn what all these plants are up here and what their medicinal uses are. Now, nothing like that had ever occurred to me. It was not on my plan. It was not part of, any kind of thing that had ever occurred to me, but I just went, I got to do that. So I found a local herbalist in Boulder and bribed her, because herbalists then were all quite often poor and susceptible to bribery. So I said, I'll pay you $100. Come up and, take me for a walk. And so she did, and started showing me all these plants. And, I talk about this in the books, and sort of one thing leads to another. And I get more and more involved in that. And I started spending, hours every day for the next 7 years with those plants. And, so one day I'm sitting with a plant there called usnea, and all of a sudden I just went into this sort of dream state, and I saw, I was in the same landscape, but it was a bit different, and I saw walking toward me over the meadow this, what looked like a young man, and he gets up really close to me, and I can see his hair is usnea, and when I look at his eyes and his face, I can see he's really very, very old. Far older than any human being I'd ever met. And he comes up really close and looks at me in the eyes, and he goes, you've been sitting with me in a good way, and I just wanted to tell you that the reason why usnea works well for human lungs is it's medicine for the lungs of the planet, the trees. That's why it grows on trees. And then he just smiled at me and turned and walked away, And so I sort of come back to myself, and I'm going, now this is really interesting. And so I thought, because I was feeling a little funny. It's one thing to sort of, but to start to get direct information about plant medicinal use was sort of challenging my orientation and my identity. But the interesting thing is, it never occurred to me that plants were doing something here besides pining away for our existence, because I was so anthropomorphic and narcissistic then. And so I thought, I think I want to find out more about this. So I finally found a whole bunch of ethnology texts in the basement of the University of Colorado Library that had first-person interviews with medicine people in North America and a lot of different tribal groups. And Frances Dinsmore had tended to be the best of those people, those writers, and she would ask them, how did you come to understand the uses of these plants? And they all said the same thing. They said, well, it came to me in a vision or a dream, or the plant told me. And they would recount some of the visionary experiences they had, which weren't really that different than my own. And that's the first time I really started to become acutely aware that there was a different way to gather information about the world than reductive science and trial and error. And all of those people also talked, they'd say, if you ask ancient and indigenous cultures where they live in their body, they tend to gesture to the region of the chest. Whereas if you ask people in our culture, they're going to point, about an inch above the eyebrows and 2 inches into the skull. And that's a very different and unique shift in human history, because it's orienting us in the brain rather than in the heart, for instance. And so I started really looking at this and how the indigenous people talked about it, and really the secret of that whole way of gathering information, and I've spent decades, working with it, is the restoration of the feeling sense, because you can't work with the subtle meanings that we're surrounded with without doing that. And again, everybody knows about it. You come home and you see your mate and you walk in and you go, "How are you?" And your mate goes, "Fine." Well, right there, you know that he or she is not fine. And one of the greatest mistakes you can make in your life is to take them at face value, because then you're going to have a huge fight. So what it really comes down to is the form of a thing has very little to do with the meaning that's inside of a thing. And indigenous cultures had spent thousands upon thousands of years learning to understand the natural world in which they were embedded, and they read it very much the way we read books. And we read words, and yes, the word has a meaning we can find in a dictionary, but it's also the context that gives us an idea of the meaning. And then there's subtleties such as irony or sarcasm that shift the meaning in unexpected ways. And what they were really doing was reading the book of nature and working with the meanings that everything they encountered had. And also, one of the things about language and writing is that the words in a sentence interact with each other. They form a coherent whole, just as all of the sentences in the paragraph do. And so there's this kind of communication that occurs between the words, though it's generally only writers that work deeply with language that tend to understand that. And so that's what they were doing. And so by being immersed in that way, and that developing to such an extreme level their capacity for perceiving meaning through the subtle feelings there are the feeling complexes that would arise in them as they approach something outside themselves. I mean, one of the nice ones that I heard was the Bushman, the Kalahari, said, every human being must wake up twice. They must wake up their body in the morning, and then they must wake up their heart to the touch of the world upon them. And that's just something we've forgotten, and we've been trained out of. So one of the things I told my students and apprentices over the years is the first thing they really have to do is begin to re-educate that part of themselves that has been shut down since they were 6 years old when they started school, and to, with everything they encounter, look at it, allow the visual image to become really acute in their perception, and then to just say, how does it feel? And right in that moment, there's going to be this burst of feeling and intimation of mood that has a really unique nature to it. And that meaning, that sort of intimation of mood or feeling that sort of bursts into their awareness at that moment is a key to the deeper meanings that the thing has. And, in the beginning, so for instance, you go to that restaurant and you walk in and it feels kind of weird. If you stay there and you go, well, why does it feel weird? What you begin doing then is you begin accumulating a sort of a database of the meanings that you encounter in the world. And that gives us a clue. Like, we've all met a dog that looked like it might be nice, and we start to go up to pet it, but then we have this weird feeling that it's not really a nice dog. And that's sort of the thing that you begin to do. But in the indigenous world, that sort of dictionary of meanings was extremely well developed. And as you do that and learn to read the world through that kind of process, oddly enough, more and more visionary experiences just naturally begin to emerge into your experience. And you start to develop the ability to learn in the old way to get the direct transmission of knowledge from the world without going through reductive analysis and trial and error. And it's a very, the ancient Athenians talked about it, the Romans talked about it. It's not a strange phenomenon. It's as natural to us as breathing.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. It's innate. It feels really far away for so many of us, and for me it does oftentimes too. I can just get so in my head, but it's the deepest ancestral knowing is knowing in that way, and it's still right here, right inside of our bodies.
I mean, one of the odd things is if you think about literally what a lot of people say, they'll say they don't feel well. And they always, everybody interprets that to mean their interior world, but what they're actually saying is, I don't feel well. I might think well, but I don't feel well. And there's a real reason that such a huge proportion of the United States is on antidepressants all of the time. And the ancient Athenians called that moment, when you see a puppy, there's that kind of immediate exchange of energy. They called that moment aesthesis. It's the exchange of soul essence between two life forms. And, they say something leaves the human body and goes into the puppy, something leaves the puppy and goes into the human body. And at that exact moment that happens, there's a deep breathing in and inspiration. And they said the source of inspiration is in the world, not in the isolated human being. I mean, this dynamic I'm talking about, as you immerse yourself more and more into it, the long loneliness of the human species begins to end, and we begin to feel that we are companioned by other ensouled beings who care for our welfare and are communicative. And so this is really the first time in the history of human habitation of Earth that people have been isolated, as Robert Bly put it, inside their own houses. And we look out of the windows, our eyes, we look out of the windows at a world which contains no soul, in which we can have no meaningful contact. And so there's this terrible existential loneliness and depression that begins to enter human life that is a sickness, and it comes from the loss of capacity to feel the touch of the world upon us. And so, that's really, in my opinion, the greatest danger that we face, and also the root of the majority of problems that we have. If people in this culture, as a general rule, had that feeling, it would be much harder for them to clear-cut a forest, to hunt a species to extinction, to pollute the atmosphere. You have to be, or as James Hillman once put it, he says, only when science convinced us that the world was dead could they begin their autopsy in earnest. And as soon as you hear that, there's this kind of grief that begins to emerge inside, because it tells us something really important about a bad choice, or as Gregory Bateson once put it, an epistemological mistake.
Yeah, well, speaking of not feeling well and trying to wipe out life forms on the earth, we're speaking in January of 2018. This marks the 100-year anniversary of the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918. The world has changed since then, and in the book, Herbal Antivirals, you write, we now face the emergence of epidemics more devastating than any known before. If we are to adapt, we have to see with different eyes, understand through a different paradigm. We have to realize that viruses are not what we thought them to be. We have to learn to see them as they are. So viruses are commonly misunderstood and very underestimated. Oh, it's just the flu. Can you explain the nature and intelligence of viral life forms for us and tell us what we can learn from what happened to the human species 100 years ago?
Well, I've been working with understanding bacteria for a long time, and eventually that moved into looking at viruses. And just to touch on bacteria a little bit, bacteria are now known to be far more intelligent than human beings, and that is something that irritates people no end. But bacterial researchers all around the world are finding that bacteria are supremely intelligent organisms, that they have culture, that they are really the most exquisite tool makers on the planet, that they can change their genome structure at will, that they literally design changes in their genome structure to deal with environmental inputs. And one of the things, of course, that concerns bacteria all around the world now is the trillions of tons of antibacterial substances that human beings are dumping into the ecosystem. And, of course, James Lovelock's colleague, Lynn Margulis, was one of her great innovations was the idea of symbiogenesis, that unlike life forms combined together to form a third very different organism. And she found all life form on this planet is basically bacterial innovations, that we are a form of bacteria ourselves. So that dynamic, by attacking bacteria and thinking we could do that without sort of any side effects, occurred because our beliefs about bacteria were so incorrect, that they were just these stupid organisms and we could do this stuff to, protect us so we could live forever. And of course that didn't understand, population limits, that ecosystems where there's unrestrained population always crash sooner or later. You can't sustain that. They can't sustain it. So then I began to look at viruses, and, it gets even weirder if you look at prions, which I don't really want to talk to you about today, but viruses are considered by the majority of researchers to be non-life, which is, of course, stupid. They act like life. They reproduce. They do all kinds of things that all other life forms do. And one of the interesting things about viruses that's really crucial and very few people understand is that whenever an organism emerges out of the ecological matrix of the planet, it does so for a particular ecological reason. And that species will tend to be, it will reproduce and spread. And what happens is over long evolutionary timelines, it becomes genomically isolated. And one of the great innovations that the Earth has come up with was how to keep the genome in species vital in ability to respond to environmental perturbations. So the fascinating thing is that, for instance, when we're bit by a mosquito, and mosquitoes have this, viruses have this really interesting habit of getting into the DNA structure of all life forms and snipping off little pieces to take with them and leaving little pieces behind. And so when you begin to look deeply at the human genome, you find that there's plant DNA in there and starfish DNA and bird DNA. And so we're not really as isolated of a species as we think. There's DNA from multiple life forms in our DNA structure as well. And one of the things that viruses do is they spread, they sort of counteract the genomic isolation that species go through under long timelines, and that's one of their major functions. They also are highly protective of their territory. For instance, there's been some really great research that shows monkeys, for instance, that will be infected with a certain virus in a certain eco-range of Africa, that if other monkeys begin to move into that territory, the viruses will en masse infect the new monkeys, and the infection in their host population, it doesn't cause any problems, but in the new ones, it'll kill them off really quickly, so it maintains ecological integrity. And, I mean, that's just a tiny look at what they do. So by our disturbance of the ecological balance of the planet through industrialization and technology and just a bad point of view, what we've been doing is releasing bacteria and viruses into the human population in a way that I just don't know that it's ever happened before on the planet. And at the same time, by dumping, these trillions of tons of antimicrobial substances, it's changing the behavior pattern of those bacterial and viral populations. So we've had this really strange belief, and most people really in America do believe it one way or another, that through rationality we can, in this sort of reductive scientific mechanicalistic thinking, we can control the natural world so that we will be safe from death, which is obviously ridiculous. We're all supposed to biodegrade, and that's one of the funny things for me about, my liberal tribe is that they're all for biodegradability until it comes to themselves. As one friend of mine said, all this love and light stuff is great, but we're talking about survival now, So, and every epidemiologist on Earth has been saying, and with increasing insistence, that the age of miracle drugs is over, that we're reaching the end of that kind of thinking and what it can do. And we've sort of put this massive chemical barrier up between ourselves and the natural world. But each year it takes more and more energy to maintain that barrier. And you can see it most easily in agriculture, where they'll use pesticides to keep pests out. And the first year it works great. Crop yields go up. The second year it works okay. By the third year, the pests have all adapted to that by genome alterations. And so the crop yields begin to go down. If they keep going on, crop yields will fall to zero. So then they design new pesticides, but they have to use more of them. The timeline between resistance and effectiveness goes down. And the thing that happens is eventually that chemical barrier between ourselves and the rest of the world is going to collapse. And when that does, those bacteria and viruses are going to flood into the human population, and we're going to see epidemic diseases that more virulent than anything we've seen before. Robert Heinlein, who had a lot of personal problems, but he was, as one guy said, the master of gaudily embellished understatement, which I thought was a nicely gaudily embellished understatement itself. But Heinlein said, population problems have a horrible way of solving themselves, and they do. And the historical record's clear about that. So, it's a very difficult problem. When you look at, if you start to talk about that, then you're faced with intentionally curtailing population growth, and it's a moral problem that absolutely nobody on this planet is going to be willing to address overtly. Many ecologists off the record will say that one way or another human population has to be limited, and because nobody's making a direct, they're not directly addressing the problem and making a choice, we're going to just let nature do it for us. And at that point, the thing is that technological medicine will fail because their paradigm is inaccurate to the problem. And I always think it's interesting that hundreds of thousands of herbalists are emerging at the same time that we're approaching this crisis point, because herbs are much more able to deal with the complexities of disease and infection than technological medicine is. And so a lot of people will say, oh, the Earth's in trouble. I'm like, no, the Earth isn't in trouble. We're in trouble. And really, it's not really the human species that's in trouble, but our civilization that's in trouble because it's untenable. So I'm very optimistic that human beings will survive as they always have, and the Earth itself will survive and restore itself as it always has. It's just that this sort of edifice that we've created the last 1,000 years or so is not going to survive, and a lot of people that is a very disturbing thought.
So did we learn anything from what happened in 1918? Can we learn anything from it? And how are you preparing yourself to meet this big
no, I don't
pandemic?
think we've learned anything from it. And, it was a unique series of events that caused the pandemic of 1918. It was because there was a first run of flu that went through the trenches in World War I that was fairly benign. And the problem was that those soldiers in the trenches couldn't get away. They were stuck there. And that, really when the flu begins to hit, isolation is the best way to go. And that really stops it. But they couldn't get away. And so when the second one hit, the influenza virus had changed its structure substantially and it had become much more virulent. And it was entering into a relatively weakened population because of the trauma and the bad food and the bad conditions that they'd been in for so long. And then the next thing that happened is the war ended, right as those troops were heavily infected. And so they all got on troop carrier ships and they were taken back to their home countries with many stops on the way. And literally, as far as I could tell, every country on Earth was infected except one island off South America that didn't allow any troop ships to land. And that stuff just blew through the human population like a wildfire. So, the researchers about it are really clear that it was a unique circumstance that created that, and they go, well, we're not going to have that circumstance again. And we're not going to have that exact same circumstance again. But the thing that they haven't learned is that, I suppose the main thing that's left out of, the belief in rationality is ability to control nature is they leave out all of the other human attributes. And, like the nuclear alert in Hawaii that recently happened, it was some guy pushed the wrong button. And that sort of stuff always happens. You can't eliminate human error or all of the other human attributes of greed or anger or jealousy or anything else, or just simply unclear thinking for whatever reason. And we've built up a situation now where the Earth is all human beings on the Earth are extremely closely connected. And one of the scenarios that epidemiologists look at is, and which happened to a certain extent, though they were able to stop it, is somebody infected with Ebola got on an airplane and flew into the United States. Now, all that has to happen is for a virulent form of some microbial pathogen to occur that's spread by aerosol particles from breathing or coughing. And somebody gets on an airplane, they infect everybody on the plane lands in New York, then all those people get on planes and fly to Atlanta and Chicago and all over the place. And then you very quickly have this rapid spread of an infectious pathogen that's virtually impossible to stop. So the thing that we haven't learned is the dangers of our hubris, and that's really the worst problem. And so it isn't, we can't prevent it. We've disturbed the ecological homeodynamics of the planet to the extent that, and this is just one factor. If you look at water tables, soil health, atmospheric dynamics, the life structure of the ocean, it doesn't matter where you look, we're reaching massive tipping points, which from a geological perspective are all happening together in a very short period of time. So and I think part of the reason for the degree of hysteria among people all around the world is everybody can feel that there's something wrong. We're not that different than elephants, and elephants can tell when a tsunami's coming or when an earthquake's about to happen, and all of us can feel this instability in the Earth's ecosystems, and we can feel this massive tsunami approaching us, and nobody knows what to do. And as a matter of fact, most human beings in the West have been trained to not really think for themselves, to not think outside the box. If they get sick, the majority of people think, well, I need to go to a doctor or the hospital. But doctors and hospitals are not, they're not very well, they don't understand much except a very reductive paradigm in treatment. And so, that terror, because there's no kind of sense of self-empowerment or self-knowledge, the terror is more pronounced and people begin to seize on simple solutions that they think will make them safe. And if you look at the massive arguments going on online, whether it's in my liberal tribe or in the conservative right, the whole thing is about how can we be safe. And the truth is, there isn't any such thing as safety. So that's what we're facing. It's not considered very politically correct to talk about it. But nevertheless, one of the things I've found from my, 3.5 decades of working intensely with plant medicines and learning about my own body is that when you know this stuff, when you know that all around your house or in your neighborhood or around your town, there are all these plants growing that have really exceptional medicinal capacities, and you learn how to use them, as time goes on and you use them more and more for your health and you go into the medical system less and less, there's this sense of being able to take care of yourself that it's so ingrained in me now that when I meet people who don't have it, I'm shocked. And I also am very struck by the degree of fear that they have about any sort of minor disease condition that shows up in their body or their family. So, I'm 65 now. I'm, going through the transition between late middle age and early old age in the process of eldering. And one of the things that happens then, I believe it's as hard of a transition as adolescence. And one of the things I'm finding is that there's a huge difference between it and adolescence, which makes it more difficult. And that is that in adolescence you have your whole life ahead of you. You're going, well, I could do this or I could do that, or you're aware of a long timeline. But at this point, the inevitability of dying becomes predominant, and you become excruciatingly aware that none of the strategies that you developed over your life to solve problems is going to work. I mean, it's not like death shows up and you go, okay, let's talk about this, or, perhaps I could make a rudimentary lathe out of this, make a spear. No, none of that, nothing's going to work. So you start to face this sort of inevitability. And I think that's one of the things that also leads to such terror in people, is that one of the functions of elders is to hold that kind of awareness. And in that period of time in people's lives, they start to understand the nature of hope. Now, when people are young, when I was young, I confused optimism and hope all of the time. And optimism and hope are not the same. Optimism is the belief that things will turn out well, and so you figure out strategies to facilitate that. At this point in time, the whole dynamic changes, and hope is a kind of faith, really, in life itself, in the earth itself, in human capacity. Not very many people write about it, but there's this sort of enduring faith in really life itself. I don't really know how else to say it. And an understanding that, and coming to terms with the fact that death is inevitable. And I think one of the things that's really difficult for people is that both science and medicine have viewed death as an adversary, and they don't really know how to work with it themselves. So when people are ill, and there's always, during illness, the potentiality for death, there's not really any human wisdom or understanding about it that they can receive in the medical profession very easily. And so it's those kind of things. Coming to terms with that, for me, is something that's important. But looking prior to this, when I was in middle age and still played around with optimism, that the knowledge of the plants and how much I trusted my life to them over decades, there wasn't that sense of terror or panic that most people feel, simply because I put my medicine where my mouth was. I trusted the plants with my life. And to truly become a person of the plant, to become vegetalista, means going beyond sort of community kitchen herbalism and eventually getting to the point where you literally trust them with your life. And once the plant saves your life and that sort of way of life begins to develop, everything changes, and it's a very difficult thing to explain to people who haven't gone through. There's a sort of initiation and descent and a reassembly and emergence of a new self that happens in that process, and nothing is really ever the same again after that.
Oh, beautiful, Stephen. Thank you. Thank you for all of your work, all of your words.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm without words myself as to how you've influenced me and the way I think and what I see as possible.
And I think that, I was lucky enough to be sort of a junior member, sort of one of the last of my generation that joined the great herbal renaissance with all of the founders that were involved. There was, 12 or 15 of them, and, they've taught hundreds and hundreds of people, and those people are teaching hundreds and hundreds of people, and it's spreading outward. And I think really the next step for so many of us that have been pulled into the plant world is to make that transition from sort of what's this good for kind of a thing, which is where everybody starts. What's this plant? What's it good for,
Mm-hmm.
And to move into understanding that we really sit at the feet of plants and begin to learn from them. And then there's a transformation of self that happens where we really become very different than the rest of the people in our culture. And we become people of the plant, and we also become bearers of speech in a way, the speech of plants in the natural world. It demands a great deal of intellectual coming to terms because the reductive world will dismiss it and denigrate it and will doubt our own experience over and over again. But that slow journey to the self, which the plants begin, eventually we become the earth looking out of our own eyes. We learn how to become old growth, just like the great trees have. And we carry a certain lineage in ourselves, which is important to pass on. And then when people like you encounter it and they can feel there's something in it that's calling to the depths of them, that same journey itself is then necessary to be taken to become transformed in that way, so that after our generation is gone, we're already starting to die off, that you yourself can pass it on to other generations. It's like a great relay race of the soul, but that you're also holders of the new paradigm. And the more that paradigm spreads, the greater chance that all of us have to endure as a people.
Mm. Where can people find you? You have something like 20 books out, and will you tell us a little bit about the 2 books that you're working on now?
Yeah, I'm working on my 23rd and 24th, and the 23rd one is called Becoming Vegetalista, and it's about plants and the journey to the self. And this is probably the most in-depth one I'm going to write about that, even though I've put pieces of it in many of my books before. And that's a small British publisher is going to bring that out. I mean, if I can ever get this part of it done, he's going to bring out about the first third or so in a limited print run of 550 copies, hopefully the end of this year, very early next year. And then hopefully by the end of the following year I'll finish it, and then it'll come out early in 2020. And I'm also at the same time working on a book on chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which has a lot of similarities to Lyme, but if nobody's ever really done anything on it, there's no real medical treatment for it. And there's something like 40 million Americans that suffer from it, and it's generally a terminal diagnosis. So, because I have really early stages of that from a pneumonia I caught a couple of years ago, I thought, well, I wasn't going to do any more medical herbals, but we're talking about survival here.
Yeah, my 96-year-old grandma who just got over the flu has COPD, and it's scary.
Right. And a lot of people put it down to smoking, but what's really true is less than 25% of smokers get COPD, and it has a lot to do with a lot of other things. I mean, for me, because I've, done, I buy crummy houses, I fix them up. It's like kind of my giant art form, and I've done it for 40 years now, and inhaling all of that particulate matter and all of the toxic chemicals and everything over the years, it puts a real strain on the lung system that then when you get a really serious pneumonia or something, then it kind of kicks over into this long-term low-level inflammation that becomes COPD, and it just gets worse. So really the majority of people that have it were not smokers. Most smokers don't get it. So that's, that's one of the things about tobacco. It's always really a bad idea to decide a plant is, evil. As herbalists, that's one of the things that we learn early on. So anyway, that's another one of my tiny rants that I could go on forever.
Yeah, I love all your rants.
Yeah, rants are important,
Yeah, you have some really interesting paradigm-shifting rants. Okay, thank you, Stephen.
You're very welcome, Amber. Thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you for taking these medicine stories in. I hope they inspire you to keep walking the mythic path of your own unfolding self. I love sharing information and will always put any relevant links in the show notes. You can find my blog, handmade herbal medicines, and a lot more at mythicmedicine.love. While you're there, be sure to click the black banner across the top of the page to take my quiz, Which Magical Herb is Your Spirit Plant? It's a fun and lighthearted quiz, but the results are really in depth and designed to bring you into closer alignment with the medicine that you're in need of. If you love the show, please consider supporting my work at patreon.com/medicine stories. There's some cool rewards there, like exclusive content, free access to my herbal ebook and online course, and the ability to chat with me. I am a crazy, busy, and overwhelmed mom, and adding another project into my life with this podcast is a questionable move. But I'm also so excited about it and just praying that the Patreon will allow me the financial wiggle room to keep doing it. Another way that you can support, if that's not an option, is to head over to iTunes and subscribe and review the podcast. That would be super helpful. Thank you. And thank you to Marie Sue for providing the music that I use. That's Marie with 2 E's, Sioux. This is from her song Wild Eyes, one of my favorites. Check out Marie Sue. Beautiful music. Thank you, and I look forward to next time. Bye.